Welcome to Energy Thinks, a podcast about the oil and gas industry's role in the energy future. I'm Tisha Schuller, your host and the CEO of Adamantine Energy. I am so delighted that this season 9, is paired with the release of my new book, The Myth and the Moment, From Polarization to Progress in the New Energy Future. And I today get to speak with Arjun Murti. He's partner of Veriten and author of the Super Spiked newsletter and video series. We were only going to talk for 30 minutes, and I even got to meet Arjun in person last week, and we spent 2 hours together. And still, we talked much longer than that and could have talked for hours. He is a great thought partner. You can learn more about Arjun in our show notes. If you'd like to stay connected, I hope you'll go to energythinks.com to learn more about our work at Adamantine. While you're there, please go ahead and subscribe to my weekly newsletter. Both of these things are true. I think you're going to find a lot of things interesting in this talk, but one is this idea of talk the book, which is Wall Street parlance. And I think it's interesting to think about talk the book in terms of how also anyone talks the book, whatever their identity is, their political identity is, when they think about energy and climate. At the end of the episode, I will provide you a little bit of solo pod-like updates on some things that are happening and some things coming up, just to keep you connected to my work. There's so much going on with the release of the book. I hope that you enjoy my conversation with Arjun Murti. Arjun, thank you so much for joining me again on the Energy Thinks podcast.
Tisha, it is awesome to be back with you. Thank you for inviting me.
So you've spent many years, we won't say how many, and really cool roles as an equity research analyst, a senior advisor, a board member. You have this global experience and expertise, both traditional energy, a lot of traditional energy, but also thinking about new energy and new energy technologies. I love your weekly email and video podcasts. They've really impacted my thinking a lot. And so let's just maybe level set for the audience about what do you think of as the highlights of your super spiked themes? And because I think that will actually be a great setup for our conversation today.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thank you for having me. And it is actually over 33 years that I've had actually the great joy of looking at this sector. And I still, despite these different roles, identify as an equity research analyst, which when you work in these Wall Street jobs, and the bulk of my career was at Goldman Sachs, you're trained to only care about trying to get the call right. And I find it to be good training as we think about, quote, energy transition or whatever we're going to call it going forward, which is, it's not necessarily about what my personal view is or what I wish would happen or what I morally or otherwise think would happen. I'm actually just trying to make the right call, which means taking in new information. If the views I'm expressing turn out to not be true, then there's a need to adjust. And that's sort of, Wall Street, when the stock goes down, if you were recommending for it to go up and you get hit in the face, you learn very quickly, I need to adjust and figure out what I got wrong and go forward. And I try and bring that to Super Spiked. And, it was originally started 3 years ago as sort of a commentary pushing back on what was the mainstream, the energy transition narrative, which frankly, your book, which I believe has just come out as we're talking today, gets to the heart of some of what I saw. I think we come at it from different perspectives, but I push back hard on the idea that you could go out of fossil fuels only into renewables by some arbitrarily short time frame. And whether one thinks we should do that or one doesn't think we should do that, we weren't on track to do that. And so we push back on that definition of the energy transition. And I think it's evolved from a little bit of, I will call it a friendly and engaging but polite protest to that narrative to one that tries to say, what are we looking at going forward? So my tagline has gone from a messy energy transition era arrives to what I'm now saying, everyone on Earth deserves to be energy rich. And that sort of right sizing of, I'm going to call it the hierarchy of needs, that all anyone anywhere cares about is, do I have energy today and is it reliable? Hopefully it's affordable. At the country level, hopefully it's geopolitically secure, because that then means it'll be reliable and affordable. And then after those basic needs are met, we then start factoring in things like the environment and climate, which is not to say they're not important, but is to say you have to get the order of operations right. And in a nutshell, that is what drives me to write Super Spiked. And then given my equity analyst background and my board and advisory work, I do spend time on things like corporate strategy, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, public policy? What do we think is sensible public policy versus not, and these kind of things?
So I really love the way you set that up, which is this idea of getting the call right, because what originally I was intrigued by your newsletter, and then it became just sort of like a cult-like following in my heart of your newsletter, is the fact that the getting the call right somehow takes the emotion and the politics out. And then you can lay the facts out. And I think you've had unprecedented influence among what I would call the true believers. We'll talk about the myth and over the course of this conversation. But the way you approach this, the true believers can hear you. It's data driven. It's like you're like the friendly geek that like we can't ignore. So I really appreciate the way you've been going about this. And as you mentioned, your approach is different than mine. Mine's a little more like maybe accommodating, although perhaps, I am learning from you the ways in which not to be quite so accommodating. But I would love to get your take. You read an early draft of The Myth and the Moment. It will be officially, I just got my first copy in the mail the night before we record, which is so exciting. It's always fun to see your book in the flesh. And I'd love to get your take. What was your reaction to the book?
I mean, first of all, congratulations. I think you mentioned this is your fourth book. I think it's an accomplishment to produce one book. So congratulations on this being your fourth. And you were kind enough to give me an advanced copy, and I really enjoyed reading it. I think stylistically, we have some things in common that probably made me naturally predisposed to it, which is we approach things from, we try to have a positive and polite tone, including to views that might be different than our own. I think we're both willing to adapt and change as the facts present themselves. Mm-hmm. And that is what I liked about the myth of the easy energy transition. And I think, and you get into it in the book, which is one could always say, hey, and I could say as an example, hey, I told you those net zero goals were really dumb. And aren't I smart for saying oil demand was going to rise in 2025? And there's a way to do that that's sort of in your face. I will say it has that sort of aggressive tone that our politics often has today. There's another way to do it, which is say, what have we learned? What of my previous views, I think, are on track? What need adjustments? And same thing for the outside world. For those that maybe were on the other side of a call that didn't go their way, what accommodations, how should they think about it? And I think most appreciate that sort of tone of positive and constructive engagement and debate. I want to talk to oil and gas companies. I want to talk to climate activists. I want to talk to everyone to try and get energy policy and understanding right. And it's what I most appreciate about your podcast and your approach in general, but also your new book.
Thank you. That's actually great framing. So prepare to hear more of that from me, which is what have we learned, which is a way to take the upheaval underway right now, and instead of making it just doubling down on some kind of us versus them, saying, well, like, where do we find ourselves? What have we learned? How do we go forward? So in that context, the myth of an easy energy transition, I think, is unraveling. I think there is evidence that, and when you renamed your super spikes, it's like unraveling that much. But for the true believers in the myth that the energy transition was going to be painless, it was going to be fossil free, and it was going to be imminent if we just had the sort of the political will. I think anyone who really is paying attention and who is charged with governance in some form has to be questioning that. What do you see as the main signs that the myth is unraveling for those true believers, for those policymakers?
It's a really good question. I think I want to actually first say what didn't cause it to unwind. And so we obviously had a major election in 2024. President Trump won a second term. And I think there's some idea that President Trump won and now he's killed the IRA, and therefore that's the problem. And I will say, in my opinion, that sort of myth of the easy energy transition, as you call it, that was on track to fade irrespective of who won a US presidential election or any other race anywhere else in the world. It was becoming painfully obvious that various elements of moving to net zero by 2050 were not only a little bit off track, they were entirely off track. There was no part of those net zero scenarios that I thought ever made sense, especially on the timeframes highlighted. The timing, scale of cost of ramping up both existing and newer technologies were always massively overstated. I think, I'll use an example of shale. One of the things shale producers got wrong is they used what was called half cycle economics. They said the marginal shale well only needs 50, but it forgot about all the other costs. And in fact, those companies were very unprofitable at 50 and they needed 70 to 80. A similar argument has been made in solar, where your marginal solar unit can look very inexpensive with or without subsidies. When you look at the overall systems cost, the cost of adding battery storage, the cost of firming it up, the cost of integrating and adjusting your grid and the transmission lines and all that's needed, solar was never going to be the cheapest power generation source in all locations elsewhere, which is one of those myth items in the easy energy transition. So one of the things you often hear is, well, there's misinformation out there. There's misinformation from everyone, from both sides massively. Companies are naturally motivated to, in Wall Street parlance, talk their book. So this technology will say ours is the best. Another one will say theirs is the best. The reality is it's all more complex. There is never any one size fits all. I have always strongly disliked these terms clean and green versus brown or dirty. At the same time, I push back on what is often perhaps described as anti-ESG or anti any of these acronyms. There might have been challenges with where ESG went, but that doesn't mean we need the exact opposite of it either. And so it is, to me, finding that pragmatic and really realistic middle ground on all these kind of things. And so I think there's a lot of evidence that the vast bulk of humanity understands there's no such thing as an easy energy transition. There are, of course, some diehards and some activists who stick with it.
So many great points. And Roger Pilkey was on the podcast a few guests ago, and he said that the trend of decarbonization has been continuous, and you can take encouragement that it's been continuous over time, and that it will continue. We will continue to decarbonize. On the other hand, policy has had essentially no impact whatsoever. And I always think that is sort of the key proof point, both that about the myth of an easy energy transition, but also the decarbonization remains in the suite of things that we care about collectively. I love the way you set up your answer to the last question, which is what didn't cause the dissolution of the myth. And because the biggest danger I think we have right now, especially in this hyper-polarized sort of anti-woke, anti-ESG world, is that the true believers now might give themselves a pass, but for the election of Donald Trump, but for, I don't know, the building of data centers, but for whatever, we would have had it. And so you talked about in your one of your recent super spiked video pods, a delayed energy transition narrative. And I'm wondering if you could set that up, because I think that's an interesting, I think that's one way that the myth might zombie us is like, it'll come back as soon as we essentially engage in some kind of super extreme progressive climate policies, and that's what people rally around rather than pragmatism. That's my greatest fear, and I think that's actually the most likely scenario if we don't all collectively gird our loins and prepare for pragmatic energy policy. But I'm curious, like, what did you mean by the delayed energy transition, and what do you think? What do you think that means for this conversation?
So I want to address this line of some people are going to say it's simply delayed, but I do want to touch upon two quick things. The first is I don't think policy makes no difference. And in some cases, it can make some difference. But I agree, you're not going to policy your way, quote unquote, to a massive energy transition or net zero, any of these kind of things. And I think we will decarbonize, but not by counting carbon. And we can come back to that.
Oh, so okay. Me, yeah.
No
Let's come back to that.
With the exception of activists, actually cares about carbon. Now you can say we should care. Some others will say you shouldn't care. You should care a little bit. My observation is the vast bulk of humanity could care less, actually. And so then the question is, what is going to actually motivate decarbonization? But I'm going to come back to that if you ask the question. So you said, what about the delayed energy transition? So I was reacting to a Financial Times article where someone had a net zero forecast, and all they did was push out the peak a few years and still had their radically downward sloping line. I think it was for fossil fuel consumption or something like that. And they said the transition is delayed. So yeah, the peak. That strikes me from my Wall Street training, someone who got the call wrong, but is unwilling to come clean on it. So the example is a stock's at 15. You say it's a buy, it's going to go to 20. Something bad happens, the stock falls to 10. You lower your price target to 15 and still say it's still a buy. It's the most gutless kind of call that I find Wall Street analysts classically make. I'm sticking with my call. It's just getting pushed out. And never mind that I'm massively wrong. And my new target price is simply the old current stock price. And the stock's already fallen by a third. To me, that's the equivalent, the activist equivalent that they're doing with. So we're going to have some major forecasts coming up. BP, IEA, all the folks that do the major macro forecasts, and especially those that were sort of most bought into these net zero narratives. I think we're going to see this fall. Are they going to simply try and punt it down the road and say, we're still right. It's just delayed. And I am encouraging everyone that we advise at Veriten and all the companies I work with, don't fall for that. Doesn't mean my view of oil demand or gas demand, or for that matter, solar or anything else is correct, but don't fall for those who are not recognizing the failed analytics of that net zero sort of mindset or attitude. And that's what I meant by please, please, please try ignore those who are talking about just simply a delayed energy transition.
And let me push on this idea, because I think it's really important. And I think this is an area that we could collectively amplify the ways in which the myth zombies itself back to life. And so let me make sure that I understand what you're saying and give you a chance to redirect me if I've got it wrong. But essentially, saying delayed energy transition is saying, we were right. We're going to have a quick transition to fossil free, leave it in the ground, net zero by 2055. What the call is, we were right, but it's pushed out 5 years because the political fortunes didn't go our way. And that's fundamentally, I would say, dangerous, because all it does is continue to amplify these polarized, incorrect narratives that keep us from working on actual pragmatic energy policy that gets things built, that gets projects funded, and that gets that will serve in decarbonizing an energy system, because we're moving forward. Tell me what I got right and what I got wrong about that.
I think I agree with all of that. I don't know if I'd call it dangerous. What I will say, though, is I think it's an increasingly minority number of voices.
Okay.
I think whereas it become pretty mainstream to say net zero is a goal that every company, not just oil and gas, but every company across all sectors should have. And here's the time frame. I feel like, you look at like the AI boom that we're having. It's forced the technology sector to actually understand energy, which they didn't have to, and they didn't prior to the last several years. Now it's something like, how do I get power today? What is going to be firm and sustainable? On the margin, we'd rather it be lower carbon than higher carbon and all these kind of things. But what we care about most and foremost is ensuring power is available. And whether it's some of the wars and geopolitical turmoil we've had, there's just been a number of events that I think have caused the vast bulk of people to really move off that energy transition narrative. So I do advise companies to not listen to the squeaky loudest voices, frankly, on either side. So right now we're talking about those still diehard on the climate activism and the net zero side, but there's equivalent number of voices who will say, just ignore all of it. It's all stupid and dumb. And we don't support, listening to those voices either, what I might call the diehard anti-ESG voices as an example. And so I think I largely agree with what you said. I think what I might emphasize slightly different is it's up to all of us to stop promoting those extreme voices. It doesn't mean I don't think you ban them. I don't believe in that. But they're a small portion of society. They play a role. Without environmental activism, we may not have non-polluted rivers in the United States. We may not have the clean air that we all take for granted. So I might not fully agree with everything they promote in terms of counting carbon, but that's not to say there's no role for climate. So in Superspike, to my knowledge, I've never actively sort of spoken out against climate activists per se. What I would speak out against is promoting those sort of loudest squeaky voices that are hanging on to failed ideologies.
Well, that's a great point. And interestingly, I think that most environmental activism got subsumed under climate the last 5 to 10 years. And there could be some real advantages to the many trade-offs of energy and infrastructure development, being able to talk about those trade-offs around other pollutants, water use, surface footprint, wildlife corridors. These are all things that I spent my early career working on those trade-offs around permitting of infrastructure. And actually it would serve us well to return to more nuanced conversations with more trade-off factors considered. But let's talk about carbon, because I actually think that the myth of an easy energy transition was counterproductive to decarbonizing, because the way the myth was narrated, the idea that there were only essentially two options, wind and solar, this just undermined the ability for emerging economies to bring their citizenry into the middle class, for us now to meet this AI boom with some kind of balanced solutions that were going to be reasonable. So I think the myth was also counterproductive to those who really care about decarbonizing. I would love to get your take on why you think we'll decarbonize, but not about counting carbon. And if there's something for the climate activist to be really happy and excited about in your vision of the future.
I'm not sure anything I'm going to say a climate activist is going to be happy about, but I will address
Let's try. Let's see if we can find one. We'll see if we can find a pony in there.
If they're still listening at this juncture of this podcast. And you said it in your question, which is, I think the key is the developing world and how they choose to economically develop. And this is, to me, what I found sort of most, maybe I'll use a strong word, repulsive of some of the net zero arguments, which was de facto leaving vast swaths of humanity poor. I phrase it as the lucky 1 billion of us, Americans, Canadians, Western Europeans, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. I think South Korea deserves to be in that bucket of sort of rich world countries that are fully developed, and we all get to take energy and all these things for granted and debate about how we're going to count carbon or not count carbon and all these kind of things that we do. You have 4 billion people in Asia. That's 1.4 in China, 1.4 in India, 1.4 in kind of the rest of Southeast Asia, who without question are moving up economic and therefore energy S-curves. When your economy grows, when your people become richer, you absolutely use more energy. There's 1.4 billion people in Africa that, for my 33-year career, I've spent close to zero time ever wondering what is their oil demand, what is their gas demand. It just hasn't mattered. That's unfortunate, but that's also factual. I think for the first time in my career lifetime, we're starting to notice some African countries starting to perk up, where we're starting to notice in a very favorable way positive oil demand revisions. That's undoubtedly good news. It means at least some subset of those 1.4 billion people in Africa are also going to join what we all assume is going to happen in Asia, which is economic growth. What I will say to get to decarbonization is, I'll use India as an example. They produce almost no oil. They currently consume 1.5 barrels of oil per person per year. In the US, we're over 20, Canada's over 20, South Korea's over 20. That's 20 barrels of oil per person per year. The rich world overall is 13. The most efficient region is Europe at only 10 barrels of oil. But you can see those are multiples of where India is today. If India was to go from 1.4 barrels of oil consumption per person and someday become rich, maybe it's not 20 years, maybe it's 50 years, who knows? That would be 45 million barrels a day of oil demand. And there is zero chance they're going to want to import that much oil. And so they currently import 5 million barrels a day. China got to 12. And that's when, to me, they freaked out and made the aggressive EV push. And to me, that is an economic security policy. It's a controlling industrial production policy. I don't view China's EV push as a climate policy. And that, to me, is the example of you're going to avoid incremental carbon relative to, geopolitical considerations. You're going to want to not consume energy that you can't control. And that is the great thing about new energies. Once it's up and running, it generally is within your control. My example would be solar panels in India. Again, lots of sun in India. Solar plus batteries are going to be a big portion of their grid, because you may not like where the solar panels come from, and I think there's reasons to critique them. But once they're up and running, you're not importing the sun from anywhere. So it's a geopolitical security argument and an economic argument for why there will be motivation to not use energy sources you don't control, which for a lot of countries is especially crude oil and to some degree natural gas. Now, that's not the same thing as saying a specific decarbonization policy, which is why I think climate activists don't like it, because I speak to enough of them to know, I want to know the path, and you're still allowing for incremental emissions. Yes, I am, because no one on earth chooses to stay poor. And we can debate it here, Tisha, on this podcast. You and I are both Americans. If one of us was European or Canadian or Japanese, it wouldn't make any difference. It's not going to be up to us. My parents
Mhm.
were born in colonial India. It is now a free country. They are American. They've been here for 58 years, 60 years. India absolutely is going to pick their own path,
Mhm.
irrespective of what any climate activists, or for that matter, the Trump administration, or for that matter, anyone in between thinks about any of this stuff. And they're going to go through what we call the natural hierarchy of needs. How do we provide reliable, available energy for all? And I think a big chunk of that is going to end up being non-fossil fuels eventually over time. It's also going to come with a bunch of coal. So if there is a decarbonization policy question to be had, I think the debate would be, how do you think about these developing world countries that are blessed with lots of coal? And are we
Mhm.
not going to have coal plus solar and wind, which is what China has developed as an example?
Mhm. You really get to the heart of the matter, which is if you care about climate, then you have to think globally and you have to think about the 6 billion people that are going to raise their standard of living. How are they going to do it? And they're going to choose the best resources available to their country, to their community. And in many cases, that would be coal. But even in that case, the opportunity to participate in creating other better choices that are decarbonizing, maybe because of emissions controls or because of financing alternatives. These are things within our power. These are the subtle, difficult trade-off conversations that if you care about climate, you need to have, not the ones, not absolutist and certainly not myth-centric ones. So I couldn't agree more. I think there's probably some interesting intersection I'm going to be thinking about between Roger Pilkey's narration of a continuous decarbonization and pairing that with your vision of an increasing energy, like the pie is getting bigger, the carbonization is coming down, but the absolute emissions, of course, are going up. And that's something we should celebrate, right? If we have a globe of people in the middle class, we could probably ultimately celebrate a rise in emissions around that, if you ask me.
I mean, and you mentioned earlier, there are other environmental goals besides simply climate and carbon emissions. It is 100% positively correlated. Clean air, clean water goes with being a richer country or region. That is 100% positively correlated. The areas that are inversely correlated are biodiversity, which gets shockingly little attention, and then carbon emissions for sure. I think carbon emissions will again be driven by geopolitical security and affordability questions for especially oil importing countries, if you will. And I think biodiversity, I don't know why it stopped getting as much attention. It should absolutely be part of the equation. Perhaps because solar and wind often do take a greater landmass. I don't know if that's the reason it got pushed to the wayside. I think just a final point is this idea that everyone deserves to be rich. I don't say poverty alleviation. I don't think it's about going from 0 light bulbs to 3 light bulbs. I don't understand why everyone wouldn't want to have the kind of wealthy lifestyles that we get to absolutely take for granted and enjoy, and that my kids benefit and my grandkids are going to benefit from. And some will say, well, that's some of them have bad governments. Yes, they do. That's unfortunate. So no one's saying this is a smooth line up over the next 5 to 10 years. Where I gain encouragement does seem like Asia is really moving in a very good direction, and the Middle East as well. And for the first time, I have some green shoots, glimmer of hopes that at least some portions of Africa are also moving in the right direction as well.
I think so. And one of the nice shuffles of the conversation right now and the dissolution of the myth is that it is less politically palatable to be a degrowther, to actually articulate that you want to keep billions of people without access to energy. The pass they got before was, oh, it would be easy, it would be free, we would leapfrog. But I think as that becomes increasingly clear that's not actually, you can't industrialize without big energy infrastructure at scale. I think that this conversation now has some real opportunities to transform. So
if you look at any net zero
ahead.
forecast, they all assumed a huge swath of humanity was going to be poor, even if they all use solar and wind. And then again, it was my biggest issue with those forecasts. You could say electrify everything, your primary energy consumption is more efficient with electric. You can do all that math, but that implied energy usage per capita for the developing world in all those net zeros just relegated vast swaths of humanity to poverty. We could debate, again, the timing at which they're going to evolve. I think pushing back on the degrowth agenda, which absolutely is part of the climate activist community, that part deserves active and vocal pushback from those who actually don't believe in it, but do support decarbonization and climate. And I feel like there isn't vocal opposition to that. So I'll give you the example that I do. I've pushed back on oil and gas companies when they've been unprofitable. Not quite a climate kind of thing, but I've given them a lot of grief and critique. Hey, you guys promised all these profits from shale. Where are they? It may not be a perfect analogy, but for those who are most caring about climate, but who aren't degrowthers, where's the pushback on your side to that element?
That's a fair critique, because degrowth is essentially relegating not just current humans on the planet to poverty, but moving more people into poverty is part of that agenda. And so I agree. If there's something even I'm willing to be confrontational about, it's probably that. Before we move on from your delayed energy transition idea, I just wanted to circle back to one idea that I wanted to understand more, which is when you advise companies, what do you see as the danger for them in buying the narrative? Because I actually think this delayed energy transition, when you said that, I thought, oh, that's going to get some legs, because there's just a lot of believers in the myth that haven't wrestled with what an alternative future looks like. And that gives them a pretty easy path. If we start seeing, you said it's probably a minority that will be articulating the delayed energy transition, but if it becomes sort of a mainstream bank type perspective, what's the danger for oil and gas companies? Like, in what way should they be paying attention and thinking about this?
You're seeing the danger right now. So, the oil and gas sector, it had rallied coming out of COVID and then into the Russia-Ukraine war. It's now given up some decent portion of those gains. The risk is actually not taking enough risk in the oil and gas sector. And I actually think a decent amount of oil and gas investors and oil and gas board members and executive management teams, I don't think any of them really believed in, quote, net zero as some exact forecast that was going to come true. But I think a lot of them do believe that, hey, Arjun, I hear you, that oil demand you think is going to continue to grow, but China's slowing and they are ramping up EVs, and that's been a big driver. So maybe it's not going to fall off a cliff like the IEA was calling for, but maybe it's just going to be flattish. So there is still quite a bit of risk, or a concern that the outlook is mediocre at best. And I think in that kind of environment, companies are very risk averse right now. You don't see a lot of exploration going on. You're seeing what I'm going to call mostly defensive M&A, meaning companies are combining to cut costs and pay more dividends. And so we've lost all of the risk taking in the oil and gas sector. The risk is they actually still kind of believe, again, not in pure energy transition as the climate activists would articulate, but in some sort of sluggish at best kind of growth. And so all they're going to do is stock buybacks and dividends. We support stock buybacks and dividends. I do. I support profitability. I support all this sort of conservative financial mindset that's come on, but you still have to take risks. Your company will not be a going concern over 10, 20, 30, 50 years without figuring out what is the next low-cost oil and gas resource if you're an oil and gas company and getting to it before others. And I worry most about the lack of risk-taking in this sector.
That's actually really helpful, right? We need oil and gas companies to be discovering and producing oil and gas. That's our highest and best use out in the future of energy. That's a great
Let me give you one example of a company that got a lot of grief for being aggressive on transition, and that's the European major oil company, BP. And I find it really interesting that they just made this seemingly very large oil discovery in BP, and it's given a new life to the company and the stock. And I even saw an analyst report this morning that said, hey, could BP be worth X% more as a result of this oil discovery? Like, I find it somewhat ironic the company sort of most criticized, that it lagged the most from being most aggressive about going to energy transition, and the stock has been a disaster, is now starting to see its fortunes turn as it goes back to its roots. And ironically, through risk-taking in oil. BP deserves credit as being historically a good oil explorer. And if they can get back to that, I guess it can add back to the sector more broadly this notion that taking risk can be rewarded.
Yeah, especially out of a European major, it's quite a turn of events. So we started talking about how we think about climate-centric stakeholders. I think you've been really, really effective at having climate-centric stakeholders take in your information and update their thinking about energy transition. You get a lot of great coverage in Axios, for example, that I think has been really, really, really impactful. I'm curious, how is your thinking evolving about what works and what doesn't? Because so much about You call it like you see it, but there's also a persuasion element to what you do. What have you learned that our audience could learn from you about what works, what doesn't work, how you tell your story, how you build a narrative that people can follow? Because you're a great communicator, and I imagine you weren't always a great communicator. So what have you learned along the way?
Well, and thank you very much for all of that. Yeah, I think people generally have responded when I talk, to be honest. So I feel like I think in terms of communicating those ideas, there's been a lot of improvement. But I think I've always had sort of a passionate style of talking, and so that does go back some time. But I'll say a couple things. I try and stick to that analyst framework of what did I get right, what did I get wrong, and what needs to change. So examples, I'll give you an example on the oil and the solar side, which is our view is that oil demand is going to continue to grow, but we also don't believe we're in an oil super cycle, that we're going to have some massive price rise, because I do think some of the concerns about China's basic economic growth and then the rising share of electric vehicles, those are things that have come true to some degree. So while I might not believe in net zero, that doesn't mean nothing's changing in a country like China. And in fact, their gasoline demand going forward is probably flat at best. Now, will diesel and naphtha fall off? There's lots of nuance to these kind of discussions. I think people might be a little too bearish on Chinese oil demand, but that's where I try and maintain credibility is simply saying oil demand is going to go up. A, doesn't mean I'm bullish oil prices. B, doesn't mean I'm actually bullish the oil and gas sector from an investment standpoint. And I think people appreciate that, where oftentimes I think I believe in this and therefore I'm all in on that specific topic or company or what have you. Same thing on the solar side, where I think solar and batteries, to me, never made sense for a Northern European country like Germany and deserved rightful critique. Don't shut down your nukes to then do solar and wind in Germany. How does that make any sense at all? But in India, it does make sense. And I already went through the oil import avoidance argument towards them thinking about different energy technologies. So I wouldn't have been as positive on solar and batteries, frankly, if I didn't stay engaged with a broader swath of stakeholders, where there are folks who worked in the Biden administration and other Democratic administrations who you would put in that sort of fun, pragmatic, climate-oriented people. I'm still affiliated with Columbia's Center on Global Energy Policy as an example. That gives me a lot of engagement with these different views. And so I try and absorb information from all sorts of folks. Again, I really just want to get the call right. So I actually do not like when people say, hey, Arjun, you're a great champion of the oil and gas sector. I find that borderline offensive. I'm a champion of the energy sector. And included in the energy sector is the oil and gas sector. It happens to be solar and wind. They're energy companies too. Nuclear is an energy thing. Geothermal is an energy thing. And it's not a question. And in different places, these different technologies are going to make sense. In the US and Canada, we should also be trying to maximize our oil and gas production. India doesn't have that opportunity. So they're going to be looking at different things as the example. So I think, I'll go say it is that Wall Street mindset. I want to get all the views. I adjust my views when I think makes sense. Some of my best received posts have been the dumb calls I made as a street analyst. Now, some of that's retrospective, but I don't do it for sort of to be falsely humble, or I do it to actually, you're trying to make the right calls. All you're trying to do is the best part of Wall Street training.
There's so much I love about the way you do it. Somehow you manage to be passionate without being aggressive, which is there's something for us all to cultivate and curate, because passion is can be catchy, but aggression is just off-putting, right? So it's like threading that needle is so important, and I think you do that well. And your humility, I think, comes across as genuine, because you care about getting the call right and you're not afraid to be wrong. And isn't it liberating to not be afraid to be wrong? People tell me that all the time, like, you're always saying what you got wrong. Maybe you shouldn't do that. But I find it liberating. If I don't have to be right, I can be out front trying new ideas, pushing on the edge of what will transform these conversations. If I don't have to be right, if you have to be right, that's kind of a scary burden.
When I first started engaging on Twitter, which was like in the 2020 timeframe during the COVID, it was a low point for oil prices. It was obviously a challenging time for our country with COVID and so forth. I was always shocked that you'd get two anonymous accounts fighting to the death over some view. It's like, why do you care? Why are you trying to convince this other person of you? And by the way, you don't even know the person. And by the way, LinkedIn is frankly worse with the with the real names, where people get so mad at the, and I find it so weird that people are trying to convince a person of their view as if it really matters whether that person agrees with that. There's 8 billion people on Earth. And I'm quite confident, again, the other 7 billion people could care less what I actually think about this stuff. And they're going to do what they think. So what does it matter if I convince, I fight to the death with some individual person, whether it's a climate activist or frankly, oil and gas is all we need type person as well, that, because I get grief when I talk about solar and batteries being a real viable opportunity for India. I get grief from oil and gas people saying, why would India want temporary energy? And they don't, but it's going to be a portion of their mix. So I always say I'm not trying to convince anyone of my view. And I always say, if you got good data and arguments to counter my view, I just assume you tell me, and then I'll try and incorporate it if it makes sense. So again,
make my ideas better. Make my ideas
I just want to
stronger.
get the stock call right, to use the Wall Street phrasing of this stuff. That is all I absolutely care about.
I love that. So one of the ideas that I introduced in the book is the idea of the problem solvers. So these are often climate centric people charged with maybe running a public utilities commission or permitting infrastructure. And have you found that the problems, like, do you engage much with those folks, and do you find that they are particularly receptive right now to partnership with people like you, people like oil and gas companies who can help them navigate decarbonizing but growing energy demand?
I mean, I think policymakers in general, I've always found them to honestly be receptive of wanting to engage in discussion. I think what I've come to appreciate, and again, a Wall Street background is very different than engaging in policy, is that public policy is not easy, and enacting laws is not easy, and permitting reform is an absolute cliche right now, and you learn that it's not any one thing, and it's not up to the federal government. It's not just actually up to the state necessarily, and there's a gazillion local authorities that you have to. It's all far more complicated, and I think and that's where I do find and I enjoy engaging with those folks. But at the same time, I'm also grateful that I had a Wall Street career and not a public policy career, because that stuff looks really, really hard, and I think could be very frustrating. And I do respect and appreciate those who are willing to dedicate themselves to civil service, to public policy. It's not easy, and you tend to please no one while you're doing it.
Yeah, and they need us right now. I mean, I think that oil and gas companies have an maybe not unprecedented, but certainly a generational opportunity to engage with those civil servants to help craft solutions that meet energy demand, but reduce environmental footprint, including carbon intensity. So a lot of what I think is compelling about this particular moment is that we can create shared visions of a future that's better. You articulated a lot around the developing emerging economies, which I think everyone can get excited about. What do you think for oil and gas companies in particular? What do you think the opportunities are right now to craft a vision of a better future?
I think you've actually hit the nail on the head of what they're most missing and what they don't do. And so I think technology companies, perhaps because they generally have consumer-facing products, people know their CEOs. They have clear views that they express out there. You may not always like them. They sometimes can be a bit controversial, as we've come to learn. The oil and gas industry has not had to deal with the outside public in like 50 or 60 years. No major oil company owns their gas stations. There's been maybe in Europe, there's still a few that do, but by and large, it's a very disaggregated business. And if you're anywhere throughout most traditional energy, you're simply dealing with other energy companies, government officials, or institutional investors. There's absolutely no basis to have to deal with the public. And then lo and behold, they're all shocked that somehow people hate them. And they've let others craft the narrative for them. So there is a need to publicly engage. And one person I've admired when he was the CEO of at the time, small Denver company is Chris Wright, and I loved his Bettering Human Lives. That message resonates with me. I've come to appreciate it doesn't actually resonate with everyone, but whether it resonates or not, he's out there engaging in normal human terms about what his vision is of both energy and, at the time, his company, Liberty Energy. I am now on the board just for disclosure purposes, but Chris Wright, of course, is now our energy secretary. And you don't see anybody else really doing that.
Right.
I think the CEO of EQT, Toby Rice, makes an effort to be a champion of natural gas. And I think beyond that, what frustrates me with the sector is you get a lot of appeasement. And so when Biden's in power, we're getting kind of quote ESG talk. Trump's in power, we're getting less than that. And it's like, there's a lot of just trying to make it through their tenure as CEO. And I'm not saying they all have to be activists. I'm not saying they need to speak as I do or Chris Wright does. And maybe he was fortunate to be a smaller company, but there's almost no discussion publicly at all. And when there is, it seems disingenuous. And so it's a completely blank slate right now. And whether the trade group is the right one to do it, which would be the API most notably. I mean, again, I think there's some challenges with all of this. Again, I don't view myself as an advocate of oil and gas specifically. I view myself as an advocate of everyone on Earth becoming energy rich through, frankly, all forms of energy, depending on the region. But some of that is obviously oil and gas. So I try and bring, I think, a pragmatic message to oil and gas. So maybe it's going to be non-oil and gas executives that do it, but it's completely lacking with companies. And then they're surprised that investors think they're all the same in terms of their stocks. Like, you guys all have the same dividend policy. You all are saying shale production is going to be flattish or growing slightly. Like, there's no differentiation. There's no positive articulation of even just a message about their own company beyond just the boilerplate appeasement language that so often comes out of corporate America. It's all like, if other sectors, if the technology sector is able, and it can be imperfect at times, but they're at least out there visibly, whether you like them or not. We could use more of that from traditional oil and gas companies.
It's such a great,
some of them,
It's such a great point. 10 years, when you started talking, I actually was remembering 10 years ago, Chris Wright, who, nationally perhaps not known as a CEO, but he held a luncheon in Denver and he invited 300 people. And the only purpose was he had Matt Ridley, who I can't remember which book he had just published, but the whole theme of the lunch was the world is getting better. And it was just a rah for the fact that humanity and life on Earth is not getting worse, it's getting better. And that kind of positive shared vision of the future, of which, oil and gas and energy are relevant parts. I love the way you're invoking that. Toby Rice will be my next guest on the podcast, so I will talk to him. I find him also to be a very compelling visionary of crafting a view of the world of where we can and should be going. So I'll spend some time talking with him about where our industry could be, I think, providing a vision, a shared vision of a future that has room for climate hawks, for policymakers, for problem solvers. One of the things before as I sort of lead us toward our wrap up of this, the one thing I want to return to that we started with is what I call in the book the temptation, and that is the temptation to essentially take this moment where it feels like all political wins are at the back of the oil and gas sector and saying, like, we won, we told you so, it's our way or the highway. I think you have always had a sort of both sides perspective of the way you articulate and narrate. But I'm wondering if you have any words of caution for our audience, for those who are tempted and also just understandably frustrated. Like, you're the villain for so long and suddenly you're not the villain. And you kind of just want to say, we were right, we told you so, like, pragmatic path forward. What do you think are the risks right now for our industry not seizing the opportunities in front of us?
I think it's a great question. I think the risks of let's just say the I told you so does not actually apply to oil and gas executives. I think it applies to especially very right politicians. Right now, there's a Republican majority. I don't think you have to be a political analyst to say we're probably not going to have a Republican majority for the rest of time, right? And so there is an opportunity. If you didn't like, as an example, President Biden's methane regulations, what would you like? What would be the better way to deal with that? Because that is absolutely an issue. If I could pick one climate issue that I support, it is sort of near zero methane. That is all valuable energy resource. And I'm going to invoke for the first time some moral argument. Why would you waste energy, especially if the developing world and others are going to need it? So it's also a sellable product. There are some costs involved. There's capital allocation. It's not as straightforward as, well, you can now sell it. But there is a path to having near zero methane. And if I'm being pragmatic, Europe's going to be big LNG buyers. Whatever we think, we're right or not right about here in America, I think they're going to stick with having somewhat stricter somewhat, not as strict as they like to think they are, but somewhat stricter climate environmental regulations. And so pragmatically, let's get to it and figure out what would be the sensible regulation. I think the executives themselves, I don't hear the "I told you so" coming from them. It's not the nature of a corporate executive. They are the CEO or executive leadership team, and their responsibility is to do well for the shareholders of the company by making money in the oil and gas business or whatever business they happen to be in. You're seeing some of the pressure pumping companies transition to power. There are lots of different strategic questions and things that companies are faced with. But being sort of "I told you so" or not, I don't see that from the sector, certainly not at the moment, or from any of the executives. If anything, their risk is just being always in an appeasement mode. And to some degree, people always want these CEOs to stand up against this thing that you don't like that this leader did. And I don't want any of that. I want my CEOs to run their companies for maximizing return on capital and figuring out what the next great growth opportunity is. I don't need them weighing in on every sort of social issue that exists out there, especially if it's completely unrelated to their sector. So let's please get away from that. And that, of course, did happen in the 2020 and 2021 type timeframe. We don't need to return to that. But the risk is what we just talked about, which is not articulating what your North Star is as a company, the North Star is as a sector, and just sort of being wishy-washy about this stuff. I actually don't think it's an "I told you so" kind of risk. And I think there is an opportunity here with a Republican majority that at least isn't hostile to the oil and gas sector in the way the previous administration vocally was, or rhetorically was, to figure out what would be the kind of regulations that you would want in place, or whatever it is. It could be self-regulation through the API around some of these environmental and climate issues to ensure that when Democrats do inevitably come back in power, and it may not be 2028, it could be 2032, it could be 2036, who the heck knows? But at some point, they're going to be back in power at some point in time, and you want to be prepared for that. I think companies do think much longer term. I think the larger companies, you're going to see them stick with more of some of their environmental promises than I think than people are going to give them credit for, and more than they're probably going to vocally say in light of the current political dynamics. And I don't blame them in that sense for zigging and zagging a little bit based on who's in power. But again, to your original question of, are they going to be, yay, we were right, you were wrong? I don't see that from especially publicly traded oil and gas companies.
That's a great perspective, and I'm willing to update my thinking about the temptation in real time. And I like your advice, which is this isn't about activism or appeasement. It's really about like a straightforward business strategy that's consistent over time. And some of the narration may need to evolve, but I think that's really wise advice. So Arjun, the final question I ask all my guests, what are you most optimistic about?
I'm most optimistic that more people care and are understanding energy. The greatest thing to be optimistic about is the technology companies, which are now multi-trillion dollars in market capitalization, or like the vast bulk of why the stock market goes up. They now care about energy, and they're sort of, I think they didn't understand energy historically, and there is no need to. So there's no critique of them, but they have spent a lot of time trying to figure out power first and foremost, and then energy more broadly. And I think I take optimism that they are more publicly centered than our oil and gas companies, and they are a real opportunity to educate policymakers in particular, but also the broader public on here's what does make sense and here's what doesn't make sense. So I'm optimistic about that. And I will say for the first time in my 33-year career, the energy demand numbers in Africa are for the first time noticeable. And so everyone is rightfully positive on Asia as a future source of economic and therefore energy growth. I am hopeful that I'm going to call them green shoots that we're seeing in Africa are real, because that's another 1.4 billion, soon to be 2.4 billion people who are generally not living in anywhere near the kind of comfort that we do. And so I'm excited and optimistic that maybe for the first time, Africa is going to matter.
I couldn't agree more. Arjun, this has been delightful as always. Thank you so much for joining me on the Energy Thinks podcast.
Tisha, thank you so much for having me, and congratulations again on the publication of your new book, which everyone should go out and secure a copy of.
Thank you, Arjun. That's our episode for today. Thanks so much to Arjun for joining me, and thank you, my listeners, for giving me reasons to have so many inspiring and exciting conversations. There's a lot that I enjoyed about that conversation, but using this framing of what have we learned as a bridge to climate-centric stakeholders and problem solvers to take some of the bite out of the politics, some of the polarization out, and instead think about where were we, where are we, what do we need to go forward. I think that was really smart framing. Also, Arjun updated my thinking in real time about the temptation, that what I see as the temptation out there are really more sort of a political framing more than industry executives saying I told you so. That's more of a political framing. I think that was smart. So I'm going to update my thinking about that. I promised you a little bit of a personal update. So on my fitness journey, you'll be glad to know that this weekend I have to run 13 miles, including some hills. So I'll keep you posted on how that goes. Hopefully this will be one that isn't a torment. We'll see. I spent the whole month of August home because my youngest is going off to college and I wanted to be here for that final month together. But starting next week, I will be back on the road for many, many weeks in a row, maybe 9 or something. But some of those are going to be interesting to you. I'm going to go to the Abundance Conference in DC, which is a center-left, center-right conversation about a new political framework. So I'll keep you posted on that. Then I will go the next week to Stanford, where I will host a meeting. Our team at Adamantine hosts a meeting with the Stanford Natural Gas Initiative that we do a couple times a year. And that's of oil and gas and industry executives. And that's always an important time to get insights and update my thinking. And then, as we mentioned on the show, I will have Toby Rice, one of my favorite industry leaders and visionaries, on the podcast. And so we'll see what we can cook up together in that. So lots to look forward to in the weeks ahead. I hope you'll take a moment and rate Energy Thinks wherever you get your podcast. It helps others in the industry find us. For more about our work, please check out energythinks.com. And please do, if you haven't already, subscribe to my newsletter. Both of these things are true. If you would like to order my new book, we will have a link to that in the show notes. And you'll also see that pretty soon my Substack will have a paid option. Thank you so much. A lot of you have asked how you can support my work, and we're making a way available that you can. So I appreciate that. I'd like to thank my colleague, Kayla Chives, for making All Things Energy Thinks podcast possible. Until next time, I'm Tisha Schuller, wishing you and yours happiness, prosperity, and good health.